Okay, let me see. Like I said, most all of you were here last week for chapter 4. So we're going to pick up where we left off. We're going to pick up right at the beginning of chapter 5. And then the goal is to get all the way through to the beginning of chapter 6, which is the last chapter in Galatians. After all this time, we're actually getting really close. And in Galatians, I think I mentioned this at least once, but chapter 3 and 4 are extremely dense theologically. In terms of the principles Paul is laying down, and even more importantly, in terms of the way he words it, it's very difficult to kind of get through and to explain. And he says some things very strange. Particularly chapter 3 is one of the most difficult chapters in the New Testament in terms of following it and understanding it. But we are all the way right over, well, we're right in between here. We finished chapter 4. We're going to be going through the end of this section where he's got a personal appeal, and then about halfway through a practical appeal that he gives. So let me see. Has anyone in here read chapter 5 recently? 2. Okay, any thoughts before we jump into this?
I just think he's really reiterating a lot of what he said as far as, when he talks about being free, it's free to follow rather than free to, follow the rules and make sure you're doing everything externally.
Yeah, it's going to continue in very much the same vein as chapter 4, which is why this section kind of overflows with those first 12 verses. In verse 13, he changes tone quite a bit, which we're going to see. But let me see here. Those first 12 verses are going to continue in that same vein in which those first 6 verses of this chapter, he's going to be talking about the Torah, talking about the external law, the Old Testament stuff that he's been going over for the last 4 chapters. And he's basically saying, okay, you've got the Torah, and you've got the focus on the external law. And then you've got Christ and relationship. And he's reiterating the idea that these are 2 totally separate ways of approaching relating with God. You can focus on getting all the good deeds in order and following the law perfectly, or you can focus on relationship. And it's an incompatible way of life to try to make them both the number one priority, is what he's saying. And he makes this point over and over and over again, but he puts it in so many different ways that the book or letter ends up being pretty long. But you can't prioritize both. One has to come before the other. And so he uses the Torah as a representation of that focus on the externals. And he uses Christ as a representation of what Christ taught, which was a focus on faith, a focus on relationship with God. And then in verse 7, you're going to see, so those first 6 verses of chapter 5, which I have over there, is that Torah versus Christ, externals versus the internals. And then in verse 7, he's going to change back to a very personal appeal. Because he's writing to the Galatians. He's writing to these people that he helped lead to Christ. He showed them this stuff from the ground up. And he's saying, I know you guys. I know you. Again, most of us are familiar with this here. But the whole letter he's writing because this church is being led away by a false teacher. And they're being led away by this teacher who's saying, focus on the externals. Focus on circumcision and the Jewish calendar and this and that, all these external things. These are what you should really care about, and the faith stuff is kind of secondary. And so this whole letter that Paul's writing is saying, no, that's not how it is. It is faith. It's relationship that is the most important thing. And he gives a personal appeal starting in verse 7. He said, look, I know you guys. Why is this happening? How could you be being led away by this? So we'll jump into this, and the format we'll use in chapter 5 here is I will read through a section of verses, and then we'll just break it down point by point. I encourage and even ask you guys to interact. If you have a question or an observation, I love it when people raise their hands and throw stuff out there. And I really enjoy it when it sparks a discussion. Even if it means taking a chunk out of class time, it's more valuable for us to be putting our thoughts in. And verbal processing, I think, is a huge deal for a lot of people. Sometimes expressing the questions that are on your mind, or even the thoughts or observations, or the things you believe, can help solidify them, or suddenly you'll be able to see why it doesn't make as much sense, or whatever it is. It's worthwhile to participate and ask questions and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into that. I'll read this, and then we'll break it down section by section. Paul is famous for being relatively difficult to understand. It doesn't help that we have a 2,000-year cultural, historical, linguistic gap between us. So there's a lot of stuff here that people will read and they'll go, what the heck does that mean? Blah, 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 blah. Let's find some kind of statement in here that I can apply to my life. Something like, love your neighbor. Well, okay, I can take that one. But they'll ignore what he's actually trying to communicate because it's difficult. And that's why we get to sit here and do this, because we can figure it out. So here's what he says. He says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. Any thoughts before we start discussing that?
Just kind of a thought on the last bit there, only faith working through love. There's an emphasis placed on you need to be active with your, in other parts of the New Testament as well, you see a thing between, faith and works. But I just thought like that a lot. It's like Jesus is looking for faith working through love. Be aware, be active with your faith.
Yeah, that becomes a big question that Paul starts dealing with in verse 13 of this chapter, actually. The question of, okay, well, you prioritize faith or you prioritize works, but what is the relationship between the two? I mean, if it's faith you prioritize, surely works has some place in it, but what place? If it's works you prioritize, surely faith has to be in there somewhere, but where? And so this, I think, is the beginning of Paul looking at an answer to that last statement. But we'll get there in verse 13. But he starts off, he says, look, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And that's one of his classic statements from not only this book, but from the New Testament. We stick it in worship songs and, I am free, all that stuff. It's for freedom that Christ has set us free. And he says, look, stand firm. Christ has set us free, stand firm, and don't go backwards. Don't go back into what he set you free from. So for those of you who've been following a little bit, what did he set Christians free from? I mean, there's a lot of things that Christ set us free from, but in this context, what's he talking about?
Old Testament law.
Yeah. He's talking about setting us free from a way of relating from God that depended on our external actions only. That was the end all. Getting everything right, lining everything up in your life, and then you can earn God's approval somehow. This was the way the Jews were dealing with God, predominantly in the 1st century AD. And so he said, look, Christ set us free for the sake of freedom. So stand firm and don't go backwards into the yoke of slavery. So the word slavery, he's used that multiple times already in referring to that focus on the external law. Because it's like slavery. And here's why it's slavery. And he said this before. He said, every man who accepts circumcision is obligated to keep the whole law. In other words, every man who decides that he's going to earn his way into God's good graces is obligated to always keep every part of the law until the day he dies. And the moment he fails, he's lost his chance to get in God's good graces because that's how the law is. There's no room for grace in the law. It doesn't work. If you were to have grace in a law system, there'd be anarchy, there'd be chaos really, really quick. So there's no room for grace in the law, so choose your way of relating with God, faith or works. This is what he says. Everyone who decides to go towards, and he uses the word circumcision as a way of representing this focus on the externals. When he says, look, stand firm, don't go backwards. He said, look, I'm telling you this. I'm going to put it really, really bluntly for you. If you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. Now, taken out of context, that is a really crazy statement. It's like, well, crud, I didn't have a choice. And now Christ is of no use to me. Like, well, what do I do there? But for him, in this context, he's drawing them a line in the sand. So you have the Galatians, and they're struggling. They're like, okay, which teacher should we follow here? You've got the faith, and you've got the works over here. Do we approach God by works, or do we approach God by faith? And so maybe they want to have some relationship with God in there, and maybe they also want to do the whole circumcision thing. But circumcision, the reason why he picks that particular word to represent the external focus of way of relating with God, is because it's like one major final act, like crossing the line, if that makes sense. I don't think, in particular, that particular action is significant, but for them it was, because it would have been them saying, this is what we will now rely on. And so he's saying, look, here's your line. You're going to cross that line, then this up here is of no use to you. If that's what you're going to rely on, then this over here is not going to be of any use to you. So stop trying to pretend like you can have it both ways. You can't focus on external works and pretend to have a legitimate relationship with God, because that's not how it works.
And I think too, it's one of the Old Testament things that it's a display of faith. If you feel like you want to do it and it will bring you closer to God, of course you should do it, but it's not doing your fellow humans any particular good. It's something that you do it and you do it as an expression of faith, but then you go out the next day and does it make you act better towards your fellow man? It doesn't determine anything one way or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, circumcision is used as a term to represent the focus on the external law. That way of life that's under the slavery of having to obey every part of the law constantly. So then moving down here, he says, look, you are severed from Christ, you who'd be justified by the law. Or, in other words, those of you who have decided that this is how you're going to be justified, justification means made right with. If somebody hurt me somehow, wounded me relationally, if they were to be justified with me again, it would mean them making amends and me forgiving them and everything going back to normal. So if you're going to find your justification made right with God, that's salvation, by the law, you've severed yourself from Christ. He's saying the same thing in a different way. If this is how you're going to do it, you've severed yourself from that up there. Which is a big deal. He's drawing them a very clear line. He's saying, look, you're going to cut yourself off, is what you're about to do. And then he says something interesting. He says, for through the Spirit by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. Which is potentially a little bit of a confusing statement, just in the way he words it. But I'll give you guys the secret explanation right here. Bottom line, he's talking about the we here as Christians. So what Christians focus on for their hope of righteousness. In other words, the thing they put their hopes in, okay? And they're saying, you who'd be justified by the law, their hope is in their ability to obey the law. Make sense? But we, ourselves, we wait for the hope of righteousness through the Spirit by faith. In other words, all their hope is on the Redeemer, God, to do the redeeming. That makes sense. So that's the whole idea between works and faith. He said, I can do it. I will do it, I'll obey, and I'll earn my place in God's good graces. And faith says, I'm going to follow you the best I can. I'm probably going to mess up. But I'm going to hit my knees and ask for forgiveness and hope that you accept me back and hope that you start fixing my life. There's a very small amount of ability you can put in yourself if you're relying on a relationship to fix your problems, if that makes sense. If faith is your reliance, then the term wait is very passive. And that's very intentional. We ourselves are we are waiting for our hope of righteousness. And I like the way he puts it. And this last statement's a really big deal. For in Christ neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. So that's a very inflammatory statement, obviously, because you have 2,000 years of Jewish cultural history where they are the circumcised and everyone else is not. And so the Galatians are a mixed group. There's some Jews in the church and there's some Gentiles in the church. But he's saying, look, that weird barrier is gone. We spent a lot of time talking about this before we got into Galatians, but that barrier is now gone with the coming of Christ. And the only thing that really matters is faith, relationship with God, working itself out in action through love. But, and this will be more clear as we go on, but you notice the priority. What is the core and what is coming out of the core in terms of the way he words that?
Mm-hmm. Actually, one thing that I'm noticing now that I didn't really have a way to notice before, but in the NIV it says, only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And I think that's kind of an interesting linguistic choice difference there.
Yeah.
Which is like, well, if, whatever's inside you is going to express itself, and whatever comes out, that's going to show what's inside.
Yeah. So you've got two different things you can put at your core here. You can have this, or you can have this as the heart of your focus as a human being. Okay, in terms of relating with God. So you can have your works manifesting itself in works, or you can have faith, relationship, manifesting itself in love. That make sense? And the love produces everything else. And so we'll see exactly how he puts this, because some of you might have realized by this point, but Galatians 5 is the very famous fruit of the Spirit chapter. And you say, the fruit of the Spirit, the whole time in Galatians, when he says the Spirit, he's talking about the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is representative of dynamic relationship with Jesus Christ. Okay, it's our way of having that continual everyday relationship. So the fruit of the Spirit, i.e., having faith as the core of your life, is this stuff. Make sense? So we'll get there as we go, but you see it all kind of falling together here. And I love taking a really well-known chapter or a section that people have heard a billion times, and then putting it in the bigger context. Because it goes from being, wow, that's really cool, to wow, holy cow, that's a life-changing principle. And it doesn't hurt that we've been talking about this on Sunday mornings. I just went over in brief the relationship between these two things. Any questions about this first little section before we move on? Okay. In this next section, he's going to move back into a personal appeal, and you'll see his tone change a little bit. He says, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves." Any thoughts on this section before we discuss it?
I mean, there's the correlation between Jesus talking to the Pharisees about, talking to disciples about the Pharisees being the leaven. So,
Yeah, and why did Jesus Christ get down on the Pharisees?
keeping the external law, not having the heart.
Yeah, he famously called them whitewashed tombs. And a whitewashed tomb is where you have a tomb full of dead junk inside, and you whitewash it, which means you take this really white paint and you make it beautiful. This is what he said. You guys are like beautiful tombs. You look so nice and pretty on the outside, and on the inside you're full of bones and corpses. And so this is his problem. He said, you're the leaven, and you guys are setting the tone. And Paul's using this in exactly the same way, precisely the same way. But you see that it's very relational. He says, you were running well. In other words, you guys were doing so well. You were moving forward. You were growing. You were maturing as Christians. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? In other words, how did this manage to happen? How did you guys manage to let somebody come in and throw you off pace like that? He says, this persuasion is not from him who calls you. In other words, the arguments that are leading you away, they're not from God. Okay? Him who calls you is God. The arguments are not from God. And then he says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And I think you guys get the analogy. When you have a lump of dough, it takes a very small amount to leaven the whole thing. And he says, it just takes a little bit of letting this kind of stuff, this kind of false teaching into your midst and entertaining it, not being on your guard, and it can mess up your entire church, your entire group. It can mess up your entire perspective and focus. Like the Pharisees, and I always like to say, it's not fair to say just the Pharisees, because there were godly, righteous Pharisees who followed Jesus Christ. But there were also a lot of them who missed the point and who ended up setting the pace for the Jewish people. So in that case, a little leaven leavened the whole lump. But he says, I have confidence in the Lord, you'll take no other view. In other words, I do believe you guys are going to get this right in the end. I do believe you're going to accept the teaching that is correct. You're gonna come back in line. And I hope whoever is troubling you is going to bear the consequences of what he's doing. And then this is interesting. He says, if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? What does he mean?
It means that he brought them, Christianity, and if circumcision was still important within Christianity, then he wouldn't have a reason to differ and to be in conflict with the people who do want it.
Yeah, I think that's close. Well, it's interesting. He uses the term still preach circumcision as if they had maybe said, well, you're still preaching circumcision. Or it seems like he's implying that somebody has claimed that he is preaching circumcision somewhere. And he says, look, if that were true, why am I still being persecuted for my views on circumcision? Because he was getting a lot of heat for his view that new Gentile Christians shouldn't have to be circumcised. And so this is one of those cases where you have to speculate a little bit and use the context to define what's happening. But based on this, it seems like whatever false teachers came in possibly told the Galatians, Paul agrees with us. Paul believes you should be circumcised. And he's saying, look, if that were true, if I still preach circumcision, why would I be persecuted for my views about circumcision? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. In other words, if that were the case, that I were still preaching circumcision, there'd be no reason that people would be angry with me. There'd be no offense to my teaching. But clearly, I'm offending a lot of people with my teaching still. So he's just apparently correcting what seems to have been a rumor circulating about him, or maybe particularly in the Galatian church. And then he says probably the harshest single statement in the entire New Testament, at the very least of anything that he said. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. In other words, basically saying, I wish these false teachers would come to ruin in a very harsh way. It's actually kind of a clever little play on words in a grotesque way. Because the whole issue here is they're coming in and saying external law, and circumcision is the foremost of those. Okay? The foremost that they were proclaiming. So in other words, these people are bothering you because they insist upon circumcision. I wish they themselves would be cut off. The Greek phrasing makes it so it's less like that they would be castrated and more like they themselves would be cut off and thrown away like the excess of a circumcision. So it's a very crude way of saying it, but he's very frustrated. He's very angry. Jesus had a similar perspective. He says, better would it be for you to be tied to an anchor and thrown into the sea than for you to mislead people who are trying to learn and go on the right track. He says, for a teacher, you have a huge amount of responsibility because you have the opportunity to speak into someone's life. And that's true of not just people like me where I'm actually teaching a class, but in any case in which someone has come to you looking for advice or trying to understand something, and you have the opportunity to speak into their lives and help them understand, there's a massive vote of responsibility. He said, it'd be better for you to drown yourself than to mislead that person into something that could affect for the rest of their lives the way they approach God, the way they approach morality, and the way they approach their priorities. Make sense? It's a big deal. And so this is why he's being so angry and crude. If you take that out of context, you're like, Paul's kind of a jerk. You take it within context, he's very serious about the gospel, and he's very serious about the lives of these new Christians.
Yeah, like the first time I read this chapter before we had done like the understanding the context, and I read that, I was like, whoa, wait, he said what?
Yeah. Any questions about this?
I think it's interesting. This particular section here, you can really sense the personal frustration more than just the last sentence there. But you can sense he just wants to show up and wring their necks a little bit.
Yeah. He's clearly frustrated with the whole thing, and Paul is. Some people talk about him like he's a man who's just angry and loses his temper. And I think he's a man who's not afraid of conflict and who knows what's right very, very clearly and who gets as angry as Jesus did with people who try to pervert the whole thing. Remember the one time where Jesus really flew off? It was to people who had taken a place of meeting with God and turned it into a place where people could, basically into what Catholicism did in the early 1100s, where you had penances and you had things that you could go to the church and you could buy your forgiveness effectively. This is the same kind of thing. You had, okay, look, we have in the temple, and if you really want God's acceptance, you could buy like the premium package with the really nice dove to sacrifice, or the goat, or whatever else. It was the same kind of thing. You can buy your way into God's grace is more. And that's why he flew off. He said, you serpents, taking a place of meeting with God and turning it into a place focused on external works and pleasing men and trying to buy your way into this. So there's places when the people in the Bible who have the most patience and the most love for their fellow man lose it, and it's in cases like these. It's just interesting. Kind of gives you a guideline. If you're going to lose your cool, it better be for a really good reason, but there are reasons.
I personally really enjoyed, because it seemed like in chapter 1, it was just very formal, very straightforward, like you're formally addressing a group of people. With this, it's like you can see his personality shine through his writing, which to me is always really, really fun with these really, really old writings, actually seeing the personality of the person that lived 2,000 years ago.
Yep.
Which is right now kind of frustrated and kind of harsh. Like, dang,
About it.
emasculate themselves.
Yep, pretty
Lord.
intense. Okay, moving on, we have a serious change of pace about to happen. And this change of pace is going to continue through the end of chapter 5 and through about halfway through chapter 6 before we hit the postscript, where he starts wrapping everything up and reiterating a little bit. But I'll go ahead and read this, and we'll discuss it. But what you're going to notice here is he's going to shift from what he's been doing the entire book, which is working to disprove this argument that the Judaizers, the names of these false teachers, were coming in and teaching the Galatians. He's moving from working to disprove that argument to giving an explanation of what it really means to be free. That big question we asked earlier. Okay, great. You prioritize faith and relationship over works, but where is the place of works? James said some years later, faith without works is dead. So what exactly is the relationship there? And he's going to give us a really nice idea in this next little section. He says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." So, you guys remember for those of you who have been here a little bit, you guys remember way back in chapter 2, he made a statement of something to the effect of, if I'm going around and teaching people that they're free from the external law now, won't they just sin more? If you say, you don't have to worry about the external law, you don't have to worry about the works, doesn't that mean that they'll take the opportunity to just sin? I mean, isn't that what he's teaching? That there's nothing wrong with just doing whatever you want if you don't have to worry about the external actions. So this is going to be him somewhat addressing that in this section. But that view is something called antinomianism. I'll go ahead and write it for you so you can learn a new word. Antinomianism. And it's exactly what I just said. It's a view to saying, look, we have freedom in Jesus Christ, and we can do whatever we want because we're accepted on the basis of faith, and we're saved by grace, and nothing we can do can earn our salvation, and therefore we can do whatever we want. That's not what I'm saying. That's.
You're taking too long?
Oh, sorry about
No,
that.
I'm just kidding. No, he's fine.
Miss Mama? You want to sit and listen to Mr. Nate?
For sure. But it's that view. Look, we're saved by faith. We're saved by grace, and we don't have to do anything to earn our salvation, which is true. You can't. But therefore, we can do whatever we want. It doesn't matter what we do, because we're saved by faith, and faith alone. Sola fide. What's that?
An excuse for lawlessness.
Yeah, now, here's the thing. Does anything I'm saying sound like anything you've heard today? If you're around Christianity for long enough, you're going to notice there are people who express exactly what I just said. Exactly what I just said. So you have this weird little swing here. There's the problem. You have faith, and you have works. So if you swing way over here to faith, well, the works get left behind. You can do whatever you want because it's all about faith. If you swing way over here to works, well, then you have a left-wing gospel. You have the social gospel, which is all about doing good things and having no actual relationship with God. So, what is the relationship? And that's the big problem he's dealing with here. What is the relationship between them? And clearly, there has to be a place for them. But what is it? For those of you who know anything about the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, way back with the church, you had Catholicism, which had swung a bit too far in the direction of works, to put it simply. It had become very much about buying your way into forgiveness and buying your dead relatives' way out of hell and that kind of thing. You could, by doing some good things, you've earned your place. And you have this guy named Martin Luther, among other people, John Huss and Wycliffe as well. But these guys who said, no, clearly the Bible is not about that. Paul is faith. He's putting forth faith. Like Galatians is his massive faith book. So it's all about faith. And you know what? Forget works. It's all about faith. Faith and faith alone saves us. Which they were totally right. But in the end, works got spit on and thrown out the window. And it opened up the door for this again. And which is, we still deal with that today in many areas of the church. We deal with both sides of it. And so what do you do? You guys ever read 1 Corinthians before? 1 Corinthians, the city of Corinth was a very famous Greek city, very famous in the Roman Empire for being extremely sensual, I guess. They had very, very low moral standards. Even for most Greek cities. People would say, that's actually, they had a phrase very similar to that. It was basically, the phrase was to live as the Corinthians do. So you'd be like, hey Bob, what are you doing this weekend? Bro, we're going to live as the Corinthians do. That was the phrase, like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Like a place with no morals, a place with no standards at all. And so Paul comes and he starts a church in Corinth. He spreads the gospel there. You notice obviously that Corinth had even more problems than the Galatian church did because you have 2 letters and both of them are like twice as long as the Galatian letter because he's trying to help these whack jobs. So anyway, the Corinthians, one of the main points he makes in his first letter is they had gotten hyped up on this thing. They had gotten faith, and it was all about faith, and they were so excited, and they decided that since it was all about faith, and it wasn't about earning their way in, that they didn't have to do anything. And they could do anything they wanted. And so they would start bragging about it to non-Christians, non-believers. And they would start bragging about it to other churches. Anyone they could find that was a Christian, they would say, well, our church, we're free from having to do anything. And there was at one point, one of the best examples of that was there was a man whose his mother had died, so his father remarried. And then his father died, so that man married his father's second wife.
His stepmother.
Yeah.
Super.
And so that was taboo in that culture, obviously, as it is taboo today. But they were bragging about it. And they were saying, look what we can do. We're the Christian church, and we're free from the law. And look at this guy. He's married his stepmom. Because we're free from the law, and it's faith alone that saves us. So this is something that Paul had to deal with repeatedly throughout his preaching career. But that's a big question. What does it actually mean to have freedom? You're called to freedom, But what does that entail? And what does that actually mean for living out Christianity? And Paul's point is going to be this: to be free from the Torah is not to be lawless. That's the big idea. To be free from a focus on the external law is not to be free from standard or principle. And we'll see what he says here. Once again, he says, you're called to freedom, but do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. In other words, yeah, look, you're called to freedom. It's for freedom that Christ has set you free. But don't use that opportunity, or don't use that freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Now, what does the flesh represent? He uses this a lot throughout his letters. The flesh.
Like selfishness.
Basically. Any kind of selfish desire you may have inside you is what Paul calls the flesh. Or worldly desires or worldly standards or whatever else. The flesh. So yeah, you're free, but don't use that freedom as an opportunity to just do whatever you want. Rather, use that freedom to even greater love and serve one another. That's what he's saying. And then he says this, the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, the law is valuable. Okay? The law had principle and it was full of truth, but you fulfill it completely as regards dealing with other people. You fulfill it 100% completely by just doing that. Loving your neighbor as yourself, and all the other gaps will get filled in. As regards dealing with other people. Which is an incredible statement. This is one of the best wrap-ups of the entire law in the Bible. Probably the second best. I think he does it once again in Romans, but there's one better summary of the entire law in the Bible. Think of what it is? Yes. Although that wasn't the Sermon on the Mount that he said. It was somewhere else. Anyway. Jesus said this. He said, the whole law is summarized in two ways. Because a man approached him and said, Lord, Lord, what is the most important law? Which was a big debate they had back in the day. The two answers they were debating, by the way, just for fact. You had these two groups of Pharisees that would debate back and forth. And the two answers they were deciding between, one was loving God first. So they had that one right. And the second most important law they thought was, it was either the most important law is loving God or the Sabbath. And they couldn't decide which one was the most important law in the Bible, which ended up being important because let's say, okay, well, which one's more important, loving your neighbor or not working on the Sabbath? And then what happens if you see your neighbor in need on the Sabbath? Which law takes priority? And so they would do this. This is what the Pharisees would do. They would discuss plot holes in the law. Okay, what do you do in these situations? So that was a big question, and it was a trap question for Jesus, because whichever way he answered, he was going to alienate about 50% of his audience. And he said, the most important law in the entire Bible is this: loving God. The second one is like it, loving your neighbor as yourself, which was usually regarded to be a little lower down the totem pole. It's interesting. He didn't even mention the Sabbath. What's the one thing Jesus said about the Sabbath? It was when he was walking through a field, and he and his disciples were picking some wheat off of some whatever things, which was legal for the Jews to do. It was like a common thing that they did. And somebody called them out. Wait a minute, you're working on a Sunday because you're gathering food. And he said the Sabbath was made for man, not man made for the Sabbath. Which should give a really good perspective on why God gave the law in the first place and why God commanded us not to work on Sundays for our good. But anyways, we're segueing. Bottom line is, this is the most important law you can possibly live out, except for the one that's above it, which is loving God. So relationship with man and then right relationship with people. Just as Paul's been iterating through the entire letter of Galatians. So moving on here, because we're rapidly approaching an end here. He says this: if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. In other words, be careful of contention among yourselves. You're a church of new Christians. You're a church of Jews and Gentiles. And so don't allow yourselves to fight and hurt and bite and consume one another. But rather, he says, rather, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. What does walking by the Spirit mean?
What about the truth of the Bible?
Yeah? So what is the Spirit?
Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit. What is walking by or walking with the Holy Spirit? Yeah, it's about relationship. The Holy Spirit is representative of a way of relating and interacting with God on a daily level, okay? So walking by the Spirit means walking with a priority and relationship with God above everything else in your entire life. And this is kind of the key to doing or to living well. Walking with that as your priority, relationship with God as your priority, and you won't gratify the desires of the flesh. In other words, if you do that, selfishness won't even find a way in. Our selfishness finds an outlet when we put other things in priority above relationship with God or above loving people. That makes sense? That's always true. And he says, for the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh, for they're opposed to each other to keep you doing the things you want to do. So very simply, the things you want selfishly, the worldly principles, and the things that you prioritize when you're walking with God, they're 100% and utterly against each other. They're going to be fighting, which is why the moment your priorities shift around, there's a stark difference in the things you care about. Almost scarily. The moment your priorities get flipped around, suddenly you're doing something you don't want to do because you've emotionally let yourself get tempted away. But if you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law, is the bottom line. If you're walking by relationship, you're not under slavery to the external law anymore, because relationship, it frees you up to just live out the love. There's no do this. It's walk in relationship and let that express itself.
What did you say that he meant by, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you're not consumed by one another?
He's warning against contention, or I guess if you were to say strife in the ranks or contention in the ranks, you'd be looking at a unit of soldiers that are bickering and fighting among one another, and they can't get along. That makes sense. This is what he's warning against. It's sandwiched on either side by don't let yourself do what you want to do, love your neighbor as yourself, this is how you're to treat one another, but you watch out for that kind of stuff. If you allow yourself to do this, this is what's going to happen, so don't let it. Bottom line.
It's funny, when I was reading that, I was thinking more of them using the law to beat each other up with, kind of like, using, you're not following, this is the way we're supposed to.
Yeah, and honestly, that is a fair interpretation within what I just said. Because a lot of the contention that would be coming between them is because they're Jews and they're also Gentiles in that church. And there's a lot of potential for argument because there's 2,000 years of contention between those two people groups. And he's saying, watch out for that because it's going to be there. And the word devour one another or consumed by one another, very powerful language, which I think illustrates pretty well what does happen when we allow contention in the church. Churches fall apart, and people never come back. They never want anything to do with the church again.
And the bit about being led by the Spirit so you're not under the law just kind of reminded me of when you're a little kid and you're getting older and you're getting more mature and you're starting to understand what, like, not just what the rules are but why they're there, and then you come to a place where you're like, technically I think what I'm thinking of doing or not doing is against the rule, but I really think the person who made the rule would be okay with it for this reason. And it's like you get a deeper understanding of what it is you're really supposed to be doing.
Yeah. It was, Paul said it was by the law. It was through the law that I died to the law. Way back. He said it was because I understood the law and the principles behind it and why it was there that I was able to say that I don't live under slavery or under yoke of the law anymore. I could see that it wasn't the external adherence to every little one that was important, but rather faith exercised through love.
It's like a little kid Charlie or Ty's age is like, do not go in the street. Whatever you do
Right.
not go in the street. If you get big enough and old enough and smart enough to watch out for other cars, sure, go in the street.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Because they're kids. They're too young and too mature to be trusted with don't get hit by a car.
Right.
Because they're going to run out and play in the street and they're not capable enough to keep themselves from being hit by a car even if they see it coming. So just stay away from that entire area is a better blanket sweep, which is what the law was for an extremely immature people that we call the Israelites, that first generation coming out of Egypt. They needed that. They needed that extremely heavy hand with over 600 individual laws in their nation. I like that example a lot. And this final section here that we're going to look at tonight, this is it. And this is the famous section of verses. And he's going to have this massive contrast here in this next section. You're going to have this big difference between walking by the Spirit versus walking by the flesh, or the works of the flesh versus the fruit of the Spirit. He says these are basically, and you see the works of the flesh versus fruit of the Spirit, the word results is better there. Okay? Results. So I'm just going to say results instead so we can get the idea. The results of the flesh being allowed to be in your priority are this: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the results of walking by the Spirit, or the results of walking with your number one priority on relationship with God, are these: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. In other words, against such things the law can bring nothing against you. There's no condemnation the law has for living out these things. Basically, if you're walking by the Spirit and you're living out these things, you are in every possible way lining up with everything that matters about the law. So you take 600 different laws and you summarize them in that. And really, these things can be summarized in just one thing, which is what he said before, that one. Pretty cool. And those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. So Paul uses the word crucified a lot in relation to Jesus Christ and in relation to his followers, because Christ was crucified, obviously. But he'll say crucified X thing. And it very clearly just means put to death or separated from. So those who follow Christ have separated themselves from the flesh, separated themselves from putting their priority on selfishness and worldly desires. Make sense? So there's actually not a whole lot that we need to break down here, because the majority of it is just a list of, it's a description. And so the mistake here is to say, I should try to do all these things. The mistake here is to say, I should try to do all those things, because what would you be doing? You've got patience and joy and self-control. Great. So I should try to do all these things. What if you just put your priority on? That. Now, there's nothing wrong with trying to grow these things in your life, but they're only going to grow when that's where the root is. That makes sense. It's like we said on Sunday. Jesus said, I am the vine, and you cannot bear fruit unless you're connected to me, just like the vine can't bear, or the branch can't bear fruit unless it's connected to the vine. That's the overall point. And that's why Paul brings this up in this chapter. This is the trick to the relationship between faith and works. Okay? Because you've got faith or you've got works, and which one is it? But it's always this one, and if you have this one down, this stuff is going to start flowing naturally out of it. And that's the relationship. But here's the thing. If you look out here and you see none of this, what does it mean for this?
In the wrong place.
Probably not in a good place. You probably got a dead vine. Now, let's be fair, okay? You start off in Christianity, you're not going to be exhibiting fully grown, beautiful fruits of joy and self-control and patience day one or day two or year one or year two. But the word Christ uses is bear, okay? And I think the analogy is very apt, because fruit doesn't go, and there it is. a beautiful apple. It wasn't there a minute ago, and now it's there. But rather you have a growing process. But a fruit tree is a dead tree if nothing is growing, okay? It's not a dead tree if nothing's fully grown. It's a dead tree if nothing is in the act of growing. Make sense? So in other words, if none of these are growing in your life, you got a problem at the vine. Isn't it really cool to see how all that fits together? And what drives me nuts is like 20 years and 22, 3 years into my life, I had, there is no connection made between all these things for some reason. You're never told that there is one. And so I used to just view the Bible as just a bunch of, there's Galatians, and it has nothing to do with what's being said over here, which has nothing to do with what Jesus said and what Peter said, but rather they're all pulling from the exact same principles. And they're
read the darn thing yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And so you take what we've just been talking about, what Jesus said on Sunday morning, and you just tie it intricately together with what Paul said, because he's just expounding on the exact same points. Anyway, I love this stuff. I love being able to look at that. That's the thing. Paul is not saying you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do this. And he's not saying you should do this, and you should do this, and you should do this. He's rather saying you shouldn't do this, and you should do this. Does that make sense? Because the results of this are these. The results of this are these. So do this and not that one. That's it. So life really isn't all that difficult. If you get the one really important thing right, everything else falls into place. That's really true. Now, there's nothing wrong with working to build these things in your life. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being connected to the vine, being growing, or having these things being grown in your life, and decide, you know what, I'm going to accelerate the growth of one of them. I'm going to help my fruit grow faster. But it is completely wrong when suddenly all you've got is a pile of fruit that's not connected to anything. Because what happens when fruit falls off the branch? It rots and dies. And I just made that analogy up, but I think it works actually. Now, obviously, fruit is meant to come off the vine and be eaten. And who's the one eating it? Just kidding. That's. Yeah. I just took the analogy one step further. And
fall off the vine. They turn into wine.
Yeah. So you got the wine.
Who drinks the wine?
What does the wine mean?
The people.
Doesn't mean
Who's the
anything.
people?
Endless circle.
Jesus.
This
This has gone on too long.
You could take an analogy too far, and we did.
Where do vegetables play out?
Yeah. Any questions about this whole chapter?
Yeah, aren't there 2 more verses in it?
Yes. Shut up.
He says
There are 2 more verses, but the section ends there, and he changes. I say the section, but it picks up verses 25 through 6 verse 10 is its own little point. You can see him clearly change tone, and not clearly, but he changes tone in verse 25 and 26. And I'll tell you, there are a few places where I say that the people who wrote the Vulgate did a really bad job in breaking up the chapters, and there's one of them. Verse 25 should be chapter 6, verse 1, in my humble opinion, because they connect a whole lot better than this point I just made over here. Anyway, if there's no questions or observations, wait, I have one.
I've actually been, when you look at this and you look at how a lot of Christians relate to people when they're standing on their, principles and the hatefulness that I see. As an example, somebody on Facebook this week was bashing Miley Cyrus and saying how I can't wait for Judgment Day to watch her get hers. I'm like, wow. Is
That's
that
pretty
the
Christian
spirit?
right
Yeah. I just look at that and think that's, there's so many Christians with that view. And, how easy it is also, how easy it is for me to fall into that when you see somebody and you get, the anger comes first rather than we need to pray for that person,
Yeah.
Yep.
thoughts?
I like just how practical all this is today. So well said.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, really, like, I can totally relate to, just do this and don't do that, and everything's going to be, because, yeah, I mean, the place I got to before, that caused me to come to Christianity was just like, well, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, but none of the ways that I know how to do it have been working, so let's try this one. Hey, it works.
It's funny how often I hear people who like don't start off as Christians just say like, just trying to figure something out, like I was trying to figure my life out, and this worked where nothing else did.
Exactly.
Yep.
And when it works, there must be something to it.
Yeah, it's funny, but more sad than anything that we're 2,000 years later struggling with the exact same things Paul was trying to correct.
It's human nature.
And still
New
didn't
tricks
see
under the
it.
sun.
Yes, yeah.
There's
The
new
author,
There's new human
Koheleth,
all the time.
Hebrew for teacher, is what they call the author of Ecclesiastes, and he penned that, probably sarcastically.
Yeah, I think it was more like to me it sounded like a slight to Satan, almost like he can't come up with anything new. Like,
Yeah, well, we're getting on a slight tangent now, but one of these days I'd like to talk about Ecclesiastes. Very fascinating. There are like two major ways of viewing the whole book. One of the ways of viewing the book is a giant satire on a way of life that the author disagrees with, which is basically, the idea that there's life is worthless and fruitless because there's nothing worth living for. There's a lot of people who would, in effect, say that. He would say, well, okay, there's no God and there's no meaning to life, and so there's no purpose or value to life, which is theoretically where Darwinism gets rolling with the standards over there. But bottom line, there's way too much to talk about with Ecclesiastes to do it in negative 2 minutes. So one of these days. Okay, thanks guys. Next week, we're going to finish Galatians.